last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning ride is okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as simple as 1, 2, 3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
what's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Richey, winner of the Share Care Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. And today, my name is Richey, and today we're going to be talking about the brain. The brain, I don't want to go crazy into depth with the brain. I don't want to go crazy either. But into depth with the brain, we're going to talk about the 5 cortices of the brain. And because we want to discuss this, I want to discuss this, but then have a little conversation at the end of it about exercise and understanding the value and benefit of exercise and the brain. So there are 5 cortices of the brain. Each have their unique terms and their unique functions. They're all named after the part of the skull that they're named after. So there are different parts, bones of the skull. And fortunately, the names of the cortex is named after the part of the skull that's over it. So there's a little mnemonic, I don't know, I came up with it, somebody else probably has it, but it's FPOTB. FPOTB is going to go through and tell you the first letter of each of the words of the cortexes in the brain. But here, this is what I think of. NKOTB, I don't know if you remember this NKOTB, New Kids on the Block. They came out and people love going to pop concerts, and less people will go to brain studies. So NKOTB is New Kids on the Block. FPOTB is a few people on the block going to study brain science. So let's get into what the few people on the block need to be focusing on. But I want to say we mostly learned about what the different parts of the brains do, and historically because of things like accidents occurring and creating damage to the brain. We learn about what the brain does or did in the past, usually because of damage and injury. But there are also really barbaric medical treatments that took place that allowed us to also understand when you do damage to the brain purposely, you hurt something in the brain, or with an accident hurt something in the brain, it lets you know that damaged part of the brain is what is happening in this person's life. And so we understand usually through traumatic injury and barbaric medical treatments that there are certain things that the brain does. And that's how we started to learn. Now we learn a lot better without having so much damage take place. But the first thing we're going to look at, the first cortices, the first cortex we're going to look at is the frontal cortex. Now, the frontal cortex is the gray matter of the brain that regulates cognition and executive function. I assume this takes a lot longer for youth and teenagers. I'm talking about my children, to make sure that this develops. But the executive function is a component of the frontal cortex. Regulating cognition, it regulates attention and reward and gratification. It is part of the decision-making portion. And that just names a few of the things, and there are different parts in the frontal cortex that allows that to take place. Also, loss of the frontal cortex is what leads to dehumanization following a frontal lobe lobotomy. It's damage to the frontal lobe that can lead to a wide range of symptoms, and it can include difficulty with reasoning, planning, controlling impulses, and it can also affect a person's personality and social behavior. So when it comes to the FPOTB, the F is the frontal lobe. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode of the NASM-CPT Podcast is brought to you by NASM-1, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources. Get the Edge app to schedule and program clients. Enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access to free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to nasm.org/membership to learn more about NASM-1. Let's go into the parietal cortex. The parietal cortex is, again, gray matter of the brain regulating sensory motor connections between the brain and the body. Sensory motor. Sensory is I feel it. I feel impulses coming in. Motor is movement impulses that goes out. The sensory motor inputs and outputs are nicely mapped into what is known as the somatosensory cortex, or the homunculus. The homunculus, this is funny. When you look at the homunculus, the word homunculus is Latin. It means little man, and it has multiple meanings. But the person, there's an image of a homunculus in the brain. It's kind of enlarged hands and face and lips and tongues to represent the size of the brain's motor and sensory cortexes. It goes into fine motor unit recruitment and gross motor skills and motor unit recruitment. And it'll look different in different people. There are piano players, and the homunculus will look different for somebody that is very apt at these fine motor skills of playing the piano, playing guitar, using the fingers in this kind of way to create movement, versus a basketball player who has fine motor unit recruitment because they can stand 15 feet away from the basket and make a shot, and then they move to 14 feet away and they have to change the motor unit recruitment to still make that shot. And the brain has to be able to see how far away they are, how far you lift your hand, how far you flick your wrist, just to be able to make the difference between 15 feet and 14 feet, and now 17 feet, now 30 feet away from the goal, and now doing that while you're moving. So the parts of the brain in the parietal cortex will be different, that somatosensory recruitment, because you're taking in information and you're producing motor unit recruitment. And then when you have to do that in a dynamic environment, like in sports, that is very challenging, and so that part of the brain will develop. Now, the occipital cortex is interesting because this is in part what allows us that somatosensory when we talked about the parietal cortex. So the occipital cortex is the gray matter of the brain. It regulates vision. Now, it is the back of the brain. So the frontal cortex is the front of the brain. Parietal is kind of the next part back as you go back into the brain. And so we're looking at the occipital cortex, the gray matter of the brain, regulates vision. And what happens is that you receive visual information through your eyes. That information travels through your eyes, through a nerve that goes into the back of the brain, into the occipital cortex. And through that, we not just receive information, but we start to decipher what that means. And within that, our brain can then register colors, and it can register depth and contrast and the spatial context of what's happening as we interpret and process the information that we see through our eyes. So our eyes are a receptor. They receive the information, but if we receive that information, we have to have something that distinguishes these things. And that's the part of our brain that once that information is received, it processes it and allows us to see the depth and contrast and color and spatial context and things like that. And then finally, the last one, the temporal cortex, the gray matter of the brain regulating learning and memory. Damage to the temporal cortex via traumatic brain injury is common. It can result in loss of memory, reduced or inability to learn new information post-injury. And I saw this happen with my grandmother, where she was taking us out to Opryland. It was a place, an amusement park in Nashville, Tennessee. And it wasn't with me or my brothers, but there were other cousins that she'd taken out, and she tripped and fallen and hit her head. And then it was from that we saw the decrease in the ability to maintain, to learn new things, to receive new information. And the short-term memory was really, really fading. Now, she was the memories from the past were embedded deeply in there, and she would share those stories. But new information was very challenging for her, to the point that it was impossible after a certain amount of time had passed. Damage to there is not good, but the brainstem is a place where if damage happens, it can be far, far more dangerous. The quadrant of the brain regulates basic life functions, includes consciousness, sleeping, breathing, and thirst. So traumatic injury to the brainstem immediately leads to unconsciousness and is life-threatening. Now, when it comes to the brain is filled with billions of motor and sensory units, and well, nerves. So they're billions of nerves, and it is the wiring within the brain that connects and allows us to receive information and interpret information and learn and move. And I think this is interesting because when we produce force with our muscles, and muscle contractions do this, it creates something called a myokine. A myokine is a chemokine. It's a chemical that is produced through muscle contraction. And one of those myokines is something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, commonly called BDNF. And BDNF is a growth factor, and it's beneficial for nerve cells to grow and survive. It supports neuroplasticity, and it's vital for learning and memory. Well, here's the great thing. BDNF can be as one person put it, miracle grow for the brain. And how do we get BDNF? Well, we get BDNF through exercise. Exercise is helpful to the brain in so many ways, but we know that exercise can produce large amounts of BDNF, and it helps with learning, it helps with memory, and it helps with neuroplasticity. Particularly things, so exercise and contraction does it. But we also see that exercise that has a thinking component to it is also important to produce greater levels of learning and BDNF. And so we see that in new exercisers that are just trying to lift weights, and you see that they're uncomfortable with their movements, they don't have good coordination, but we know that when they don't do that and they practice it, they actually have a greater production of neural connectivity that allows them to refine and get better at it. We see this very much in people who are dancers, who are using their brain and their body at the same time. Martial artists, many team and individual sports have this component to it. And I love this because Dr. John Ratey said that we should replace the term dumb jock with the term smart jock, because it seems that those that have higher levels of physical activity have greater dendrite growth, more neural connections, and greater neuroplasticity. Go exercise. Thank you for taking the time to sit through this very heady, stop it, the very heady conversation about exercise, about the brain, and the different cortices of the brain. Like, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family. And if you want to reach out to me, you can do so. Hit me up on Instagram at dr.rickrichey, or email me rick.richey@nasm.org. Y'all keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM-CPT Podcast.